Now, I can go back a little bit and tell you a little bit of my personal testimony. I was saved at the age of 8. Really saved. I remember riding horseback in West Texas. We got down off of our horses and we prayed, and I received the Lord. But I can go back further than that to let you know that just like your life, my life wasn't easy either. My parents were divorced when I was 5 years old. And this was very hard on me. My father left. And I lived with my mother and my sister from 5 years on. And of course, if you come from that kind of a situation, you realize what it does to you psychologically. And when I started school, I was very scared of everything. Because, your security has just been jerked right out from under you. And I remember from the first grade, the second grade, the third grade, the fourth grade, and the fifth grade, every time we had a test, some kind of test, I would cry. I would just cry because I had nothing behind me. No backing. No security. No nothing. This is the kind of shape I was in. Is the Lord's mercy. Then, saved at 8, went on through high school. And in high school, I was successful in several things. No need to mention what. But it was by being successful in those things in several different areas that it kind of propped me up a little bit. But then when I went to college, I found out everybody in college had been a star in high school. So, I hit the bottom. My first year in college, I went to the bottom. I just hit a deep depression. And the whole thing of the insecurity of my father leaving and everything and him growing up in such a way, it hit me so hard in my first year in college. And I had no choice but to turn to the Lord. I had no choice but that was the only place I had to go was to the Lord. And so my father was a lawyer. I had 3 uncles that were lawyers. Eventually now I have 2 brothers that are lawyers, 3 brothers that are lawyers, 5 cousins that are lawyers. Everybody were lawyers. So I was in pre-law at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. I was going to be a lawyer too. But as I more and more began to turn to the Lord, at that time I was in the Southern Baptist denomination. I did not know anything of life that much. I just knew I had to have the Lord. But the more I would pray in the feeble way I did, accidentally no doubt, I would hit the switch every now and then. I didn't know about my spirit. I didn't even know Christ was in me. But I was desperate to pray, so I touched Him occasionally. It became clear then I could not continue in pre-law. I had no burden to go that direction. Well, of course, in a denomination, there's only one other thing to do, and that is to serve the Lord in some kind of capacity. So, I went forward in the invitation and said, I want to serve the Lord. So, then I began to prepare my college in that direction to go to seminary. So I graduated from college in 1957. And I was 21 years old. I should have been beginning college at that time instead of graduating. And at the same time, not too long after that, then my mother died, which was the only home I had. And so by the time I was 21, in a sense, I was really on my own. Or a little past that. Then when I went to the seminary, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, the largest seminary in the world. And it still is, but it doesn't mean much. I went there. It didn't take me long. I think it was because I had been so desperate to touch the Lord, to seek the Lord because of no other words to use, but of the insecurity that had built up because of my family's divorce and been raised in the way that I I'd been so desperate to touch the Lord, I think I knew a little bit of how to touch the Lord. A little bit. Just very teeny. Anyway, it didn't take me one semester to realize this whole seminary thing was a farce. It was a union card. That's the way I looked at it. I told other people, it's a union card. I realized, I'll go ahead, I'll get the degree because you've got to have your union card. There's nothing there. Nothing there really for the Lord. The only thing I received, I got the degree, the only thing that's worth anything was Greek and Hebrew. The rest of it is not worth anything. Of course, this is my opinion. Others may have another opinion, but this is mine. Anyway, so I graduated from the cemetery. It's amazing if you would just be around that kind of place. Young men come in burning for the Lord, loving the Lord, burning. Of course, all they know is to preach the gospel. This is what Southern Baptist are very strong for. Preach the gospel. And of course, the only gospel they know is redemption. Salvation from hell to go to heaven. But you still get saved. It's still not bad. And they come burning, but by the time they leave, they're dead. It's a real cemetery. There's no such thing as that kind of school in the Bible. The church should be the place where we learn the Word to the uttermost. And it is the place. I'd take any member here knows far more of the Word than the greatest professor in any cemetery. I guarantee it. Where can you find Bible schools and seminaries in the Bible? It's not there. But you find the church. It's in the church that the Word is our living faith. And the Word becomes part of our being, and no doubt. This is our true case today. Okay, when I graduated, it was in January, because the Master of Theology degree that I took was a 3-year course, but I had crammed it into 3.5 years. And therefore, I graduated in I meant what I said. I crammed a 3-year course into 3.5 years. So, I graduated in January. I graduated in January of 1961. In January of 1961. Okay, I have to mention just a little bit. Before this time, I had no desire, although I got the so-called degree that the pastors get. I had some experience both in leading singing and in preaching at the so-called youth-led revivals that were conducted by Southern Baptists among their churches in Texas. And that's what I would do all summer, every summer. Before I got out of college, I did it. Every summer, we would go to these churches, and, it would be conducted through the Department of Student Work in Dallas. I mean, they got the organization. And we would go everywhere, holding youth-led, but church-wide revivals. And I started off leading the singing. Eventually, I ended up speaking some. But the more I was in those revivals, the less I had any desire to pastor. I mean, we were just young guys, 21, 22 years old. We would go to these churches, and these pastors of some of these large churches would come to us young guys and just pour out all of their... I said how hard it is, and the people, and this and that. They're all, even if they had any experience at all, they would explain just how fleshly the people are. There's no way to go on. This and that. This is all I ever heard from the pastors. Nothing positive. So I decided from that that pastoring wasn't for me. I didn't make any actual decision. I just never had any desire. I never entered that way. I was never ordained ever. Praise the Lord. That doesn't mean, for those who have, there's any problem, but I just never was. So when I graduated, it was in January. And so I continued on to do more graduate work for one semester. Then, in June, or should I say earlier than that, a little before June of 1961, I was called to Dallas because they wanted to offer me the position of the Baptist Student Union director. You're probably not familiar. Some of you may be at BSU. The BSU director at a Baptist college in Plainview, Texas, which is up in the Panhandle. So, actually, I had been active in the BSU in college, etc. So this seemed quite good to me, to do student work, to work with students. And so in June of 1961, I went to this campus, Wayland Baptist College in Plainview, Texas. When I got there in June of 61, there was a note. When they showed me my office, and I went into my office, there was a note on my desk from a junior in the college. Actually, he was just, I believe, finishing his junior year. A note on my desk welcomed me to the school because my title also as BSU director was Director of Religious Activities. And actually, that's what was written over the door of my office, Director of Religious Activities. And we had them too, believe me. And it so happened there was a group of those who were either going to be preachers or missionaries that was in a certain kind of club on campus that were taking a mission trip. During that time, during the summer, I think it was to the Northwest at the time, and the president of that group is the one, they were already on the trip, but he left me a note on my desk, welcomed me to the school, and signed Benson Phillips. And that was the first time I heard that word, that name, Benson Phillips. And so when he came back, I wasn't there. I was gone again. I just stayed a little bit during the summer, and then I had obligations still with these kind of revival meetings the rest of the summer. But as agreed, I'd go there and get set up and then take care of that. Then I came back in the fall of 1971. And of course, there is where I met Benson. And eventually, I think all of you know, a number of brothers in the churches in Texas were in that school. I think I can list a good number of them. Benson Phillips, Ben McPherson, Ray Graver, Tim House, Jim Coleman, of course Rodney Phillips, and all their wives. They were all there, just about. Bobby Allen, if you know him in Houston. Anyway, there's about 20 of us. 20 of us that was in that school at that time. That I think are still in the recovery. Barry Morgan, by the way, also went to Wayland Baptist College. Yeah, but he graduated in May of 61 before I got there in June of 61. So I never met him. But it was interesting, he was there. Lusby Kirk was also in Wayland Baptist College, but he just lightly touched us at that time, and he was touched later on in Lubbock, Texas. So, we had the first year there. Okay, you know, we had our religious activities. And I worked with the students. Actually, you have to realize this school was not that large. You want to guess how many students? 600. Can you believe the Lord got all of us together in that one little school? Of course, this is how things got started in Texas. Anyway, 1961, we went through our thing. We did all of our little activities. And we went through the summer of 61. And we're getting ready for, or I should say, then into 62 to finish that school year, fall of 61, spring of 62. Then came back in the fall of 62. It was Benson's senior year. Oh, I should also say Elton Carr was there. But he wasn't there the first year. He came back in the fall of 62. And he had been there for 2 years, and he left to go out to pastor. After 2 years in college, he went in Oregon to pastor. And by the time he tried that for 2 years, he was totally defeated. But he came by my office and introduced himself to me because he was older than the rest of them. Actually, I wasn't that old myself. I went there, I think I was 25 when I went there. And, of course, in November of 61, Brad was born. Our oldest son, Brad, was born in November 61 there in Plainview, Texas. Then in 62, in the fall, you do all your things. You got all your preschool retreats and all of that stuff and everything. But I enjoyed student work. I still had no desire to get into any kind of pastorate. I did do some speaking here and there. But when it came to, now you have to realize, you see, Brother Lee is coming to Los Angeles at this time, 62. The fall of 62, Brother Lee comes to Los Angeles in December, or the beginning of December of 62. And he and John Ingalls and Brother Chang, I believe, right at the beginning of 62, began to pray. And they came together every morning to pray. This is December of 62. And they prayed, Lord, you must stir up the seeking ones all over this country. You must stir them up. And they prayed every day for 4 weeks until they had the conference at the close of December of 1962. They prayed in this way every day. So as we came then to December of 62, we had what is called the campus revival. That was kind of an old term. Actually, most of the campuses, Baptist campuses, had adopted a new term such as Focus Week or something like this. They didn't like the word revival that much. But Wayland was a little more conservative, which is probably good because that's the reason some of these guys came. Because they knew this was a place, it was more for the Lord. But they were working very hard to make it more academic and less for the Lord. And they, of course, succeeded. But in December of 1962, the president of the campus of the college did a terrible thing. He invited to speak at the campus revival a person who was not a Baptist. You just do not do this. Among Southern Baptists especially, not just Baptists, you got to be Southern Baptist. You just don't do this. But unknown to us at that time, he was planning to retire at the end of that year, so he didn't care. He knew it would cause some stirring. He knew it. He knew it would cause some stirring. But he had heard through the vice president of a man from England who went by the name of Major Ian Thomas. Maybe some of you have heard of him in his books, The Saving Life of Christ, Mystery of Godliness, etc. Anyway, at this time he only had the one book, The Saving Life of Christ. And he invited Major Thomas to come for the campus revival. Well, I was a little offended too because the campus revival was totally under my directions as the director of religious activity. And I was a staunch Baptist. I mean, true blue down the line. And I was a little bothered too. So to prepare for his coming, we got his book. The bookstore ordered a number of copies. The Saving Life of Christ. You wouldn't believe that book mainly is based on one verse. Romans 5:10. Wow. Much more saved. Of course, King James, by his life. And so I began to read the book. And as I began to read the book, I saw nothing. It's amazing how you can read something and see nothing. But I did see I saw mentally that his message was Jesus Christ living in us. I even picked that up mentally, but I never saw it. I just picked up mentally. His message was Jesus. So we even, with the guy that was going to be leading the singing, of course we had a choir and everything, we worked out a little song. And we had it for a while in supplement. It didn't last very long. But anyway, a little song at that time for that, as the theme song for that campus revival called Not I But Christ. It was Not I But Christ, my song shall be, something like that. Not I But Christ who lives in me. now that I have found Him as my complete sufficiency, no longer I but Christ who lives His life in me. We even wrote that song. I still didn't see it. Okay, now you have to realize Brother Lee and the brothers are praying. And this guy comes. And he begins to speak. And I don't know, I believe he had the most anointing he ever had in his life. I really think so, because I heard him later. Those meetings were so anointed as he began to share that the Christian life is Jesus Christ. It is not you. It is not what you can do. It is not you doing anything, but it is Jesus Christ living in you. That He is the Christian life. And I have to tell you, those two statements that we gave during the conference, the life that He lived qualified Him for the death that He died. The death that He died qualified us for the life that He lived, came from Major Thomas. Those two statements came from him. But I've kept them all these years. I never used them. But I thought they fit those messages so well. Anyway, you can see from just those two statements, he did see something of Christ's life. And I believe he had some experience. He was from England. And he shared, in verse after verse after verse. And the light came. The light came. It just came in those meetings. And for the first time in my life, I saw that Jesus Christ was in me. Jesus Christ was in me. I had never seen such a thing. And a big weight just fell off my back. For the first time I realized I did not have to try to live the Christian life. Of course, the problem is he painted a beautiful picture with no door to get in. He ended up by saying it's by faith. But still, let me tell you, at the same time, I had gotten a hold of Brother Lawrence's little book, Practicing the Presence. And although I realize now that book may not be the best, it was a great help at that time, because I began to pray, speaking to the Lord all the time concerning His living in me. So in doing that, no doubt, I realized many times I touched my spirit. Although Major Thomas, he gave one message on spirit, soul, and body, it was totally doctrinal. It was not practical. Anyway, though, the light came. The light came. The light came. And it didn't just come with me, it came with a number of the students, you see, that we had fellowship with. Especially, of course, these ones that are in the church today. The light came that the Christian life is Jesus Christ. It was marvelous. And I'd quoted Galatians 2:20 hundreds of times, but for the first time I saw Galatians 2:20. And I went through the New Testament and underlined every verse that said anything about the indwelling Christ or the indwelling Spirit. And I just, right away, I thought, this is right. This man is right. And I remember telling my wife, I said, if this is right, if the Christian life is Jesus Christ living His life in us and through us, I said, then Southern Baptists are absolutely off. At the end of the time that Major Thomas was there, he said, and of course, everybody, at least 600 or more, heard him. Because he was very eloquent. He's very eloquent, he's very gifted, and he's also saw something of life. So people were attracted, although they didn't see what he said. Most, of course, didn't see a thing. But he said at the end of those messages, and I've still got them by tape, he said at the end, he said, if there are 6 of you here that see what I'm talking about, I'll be satisfied. Well, I want to tell you something. By the Lord's mercy, not only were there more than 6, but we saw more than he did. Because his idea was to take this matter of life into the denominations and bring life to the denominations. But right away I said, if this is right, if the Christian life is Jesus Christ Himself, then where can you get all this organization? You can't organize Jesus Christ. I said, denominations are through if this is right. I remember saying this word. Of course, I wasn't clear much about anything, but I was just, I don't know, I was in the heavens, seeing Jesus was in me, and the Christian life was Him. Of course, His message leaves no ground for transformation, for anything like that. I mean, once you see it, you just start living Him. It's just that easy. You know, by an attitude of faith, you just start off and Christ lives in you. He doesn't have any concept of growth or transformation that much. I have to go back. I would have to go back and read again. He might. But I do know this. He saw a lot of things. He saw that Canaan was Christ. He saw Canaan was Christ. And the wilderness and all of these things. And he said, of course, most Christians today are in the wilderness. Anyway, he was very good on this one verse, though. Romans 5:10. Having been reconciled through His death, much more we are saved by His life. And he said there are these two aspects of salvation. Two aspects. And the second is the much more. The much more. That is His life. Well, the light just came. And not just to me, but guess who? To all of these brothers. And these sisters who later became their wives. But, of course, we weren't that clear. We weren't that clear about much, but we saw Jesus Christ was in us. We saw that much. And no doubt it had a lot to do with that prayer of Brother Lee and the brothers. Sure, that the light came. The same time they were praying, we were preparing. The same time all-inclusive Christ was being shared, we were hearing the words for the first time that Jesus Christ was in us. So no doubt it was all sovereign. So after that time, I was turned upside down. The first thing I remember was, believe it or not, I had the book, The Normal Christian Life. I had it. I had read the last chapter one time when I was in so-called revival, and the pastor had it. And he told me to read the last chapter, Why This Waste? And I read the last chapter, Why This Waste? And of course, like any person in that kind of upbringing and what you're doing, when I read that chapter, Why This Waste? I said, this will make a good sermon. That was my only concept. And I had no concept of being wasted on the Lord myself. My thought was, this will make a good sermon. So I ordered the book. You couldn't find it anywhere because the first copy, I've got one of the first ones that was printed in 1957 in Bombay, India, which was done by Victory Press, but they printed it in India. And so I ordered it and I got it, and I still like that last chapter. I could identify with that, but when I tried to read the rest of it, I just could not understand one thing this guy was talking about. I read, the chapter on the blood, that didn't mean anything. I couldn't see anything. I read the cross and everything. I couldn't see anything. I knew he had something. He had to have something. All of these verses and what he was saying, but I just couldn't see. But after Major Thomas came and the light came, I realized that's what Watchman Nee was talking about. And I went back to the normal Christian life and devoured it. And it didn't take me long to realize, by the Lord's mercy, that this man, Watchman Nee, had more than the one the Lord used to open my eyes. It didn't take too long. And I read, in the years 1962 to 1963, within a one year time, I read that book 5 times. 5 times. Every time I would underline it. And eventually the whole book was underlined. Every time I underlined something else I hadn't underlined. The time I read it 5 times, forget it. Everything this man says is something. So, So I realized this was what Watchman Nee was talking about before Major Thomas left. And so I asked him, I said, have you ever heard of Watchman Nee? I think he shares something like this. He says, yes, I said, have you heard of Watchman Nee's book? That's what I said, The Normal Christian Life. I think it's something like this. Have you ever read that book? He said, no, I don't need to read it. I know what's in it. The British are very proud people. But he did need to read it, because his concept was that Adam had the Holy Spirit and he lost it at the fall. But if he had read The Normal Christian Life, it would become clear Adam never had the life of God. He never had it to lose. So he could have been helped. He did need to read it, but he didn't. To this day, he's an opponent of the church. Well, I'll tell you why. He got blamed for a lot of things that happened there. Okay. So he was there, and we, from then on, I had no desire for the organizational programs of the Baptist Student Union or a Baptist or anything. I just wanted to go and share about Christ being in you. And wherever I went, when I had the opportunities, the people loved it, but the pastors hated it. And eventually, it just took me 1 year. That was December of 62. And of course, we went into the spring. And I have to realize, in the spring of 63, before school was out... Oh, by the way, I have to tell you this. The bookstore was in the main administration building where my office was. And of course, we had ordered all of Thomas' books. And then I had him order for the students all of Watchman Nee's books. Everything we find. I think by that time there were the three. Normal Christian Life, Sit, Walk, Stand, and What Shall This Man Do? Those three were out. So he ordered them. And I have to say this also. There were about, I would say, 20 students eventually. But maybe there were 30 at the time. There were about 30 students that saw what Major Thomas said. Not all of them came in, you see. It's one thing to see, it's another thing to come in. There were over 30 that saw. And these 30 then, because they realized I saw, it's something, because you're in a school of 600 people, and only 30 see what he's talking about, and all the rest continue on in their activities and doing things for God and trying to live the Christian life by their behavior and all of this. You realize how much fellowship means. And so these 30 were coming by my office all the time, and I was giving them all Normal Christian Life, Sit, Walk, Stand, What Shall This Man Do? I was sending them down to the bookstore when I ran out of money and have them buy themselves. And so all of these students were reading Watchman Nee for a year. And some of them would go out on student trips. The churches would ask my office to send some young people to hold a weekend youth meeting or youth-led revival. And they would go out, these brothers I would send would go out and speak about Christ being in you. And I would get letters back from the pastor saying, this is not what we wanted. And eventually, I got in trouble myself. I had always been a true blue Southern Baptist. I was a fair-haired boy. I had never caused any problems. Never. But when I began to speak, not about the church, just about Christ living in you, I began to get criticism. And it was called mainly pacifism. You're just passive. You don't do anything. You just, Southern Baptists are very active. Go, 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 go until most of them go. Period. And it was called pacifism. The BSU director at West Texas State University, which is in Canyon, Texas, between Plainview and Amarillo in the panhandle of Texas, he heard some of these things, and he called us the barbarians. In other words, I'd never gotten criticism before in my life. But I knew, according to the Word, this was right. What's the problem? This is what people need. In other words, I tried for a year to put the new wine in the old wineskin. It won't work. I think probably we all tried in some way or other. I tried. The people were hungry for it. They were defeated, weary, worn. To hear a word like this. And I remember one fellow came up to me afterwards, and he said, I really enjoyed that. He said, "You never got that from anything of Southern Baptist teaching, did you?" I said, "No, I sure didn't." That's all I said. So I hope I'm not going into too much detail here. So, for a year, I began to make waves in the Southern Baptist Convention. Of course, now you realize the Lord was just preparing us. He was really preparing us. Because such a staunch Southern Baptist as me needed some things shaken loose a little bit. So then I began to see, man, nobody wants to hear this word. But I realized the people did. And then one pastor that I went and held a weekend of meetings. And of course all they want is the numbers. They want to get the people saved. But I spoke on Christ as life. But I did give one gospel message and several got saved. So he should have been happy. But he wasn't happy. He wrote a letter. And you have to realize the way it's set up in the Southern Baptist organizational system. My boss was not in that school. My boss was in Dallas. The head of the Department of Student Work in Dallas was my boss. And I was just responsible to the president. But the president, as you know, was going to resign that first year, or at least when... I was free. I was free. If I didn't even show up for a week, it didn't really matter. Of course, I did because I had a conscience. But I was free. So I would occasionally go, but eventually I got called on the carpet. And in the summer, of course, in June, then, when school was out in June of 1963, Brent was born. So we had the two boys, Brad and Brent. Amen. And of course I was very impressed with Watchman Nee, and I wanted to name him Brent Nee. I wish I had but I thought it sounded a little too Chinesey, so eventually I named him Brent Murray. No, what did I name? Brent Carey. I have to say, what I was saying, I wanted to also name him Andrew after Andrew Murray then, because I'd read Andrew Murray's book, so I was going to name him Brent Murray. But my wife didn't like that because of the initials, so we didn't name him that. So eventually I named him Brent Carey, put it that way. After William Carey, the first missionary, the first Baptist missionary, put it that way. So, into the summer then of 1963, I got called on the carpet by the head of the Department of Student Work over the Southern Baptist in Texas. Because, and he told me plainly, he did not agree because, man, all we had been doing is having meetings, talking to students, all of the devotionals, everything was about Christ in you, Christ in you, Christ in you. Amen. And, of course, the word was getting out everywhere because not everybody liked it. Just about us 30 liked it. The rest didn't like it. So, they called me on the carpet, and the head of the Department of Student Work told me, he said, "I do not agree with your philosophy of a Baptist student program, of the BSU program on a Baptist campus." That's what he said. And I realized I was in trouble. That now, what was I going to do? I either had to go back to the dead organizational system of Southern Baptist or leave. And I didn't know what to do. But he was a gracious man, I have to say this. He said, "I'm not any way threatening you that you have to resign or that you have to leave. But I just want to let you know I don't agree with what you're doing." He was a very gracious man, I have to admit. But I realized I was in trouble. So we come to the fall of 1963. And we enter that school year. And of course, there's still some. Benson graduated and left. He was partially going to seminary and partially involved in a navigator program. but he was living in Dallas. Elton left, graduated, but he got a job there in Plainview, and he remained there. Of course, I started to say I didn't finish in the spring of 1963, before school was out, before I got called on the carpet. I have to go back. This is important. Since I had been ordering all of Watchman Nee's books through the bookstore manager showed me a leaflet of a new book by Watchman Nee, The Normal Christian Church Life. He said, "Should I order this?" And I said, "Yes, get it." So he ordered 2 copies. And I got one, and I read it, and I didn't see a thing. My burden was, we've got to get life into the Baptist churches. What is that might have worked in China. It never worked here. That's how much I saw. It's amazing how little we see. But Elton Carr picked up the other copy. He was going to the bookstore and he saw it and he grabbed it up. And I have to say, Elton was even a little more open than I was. He thought it was really great. But I said, how can that work here? I was still my thought was, we've got to get life into Baptist churches. We've got to get the new wine in these old wineskins. Eventually it burst. So we came to the fall of 1963. And of course, by this time, Brother Lee had been traveling some over the country and traveling around. And even not known to us, in the summer of 63, he met a person who invited him to come to Texas in September of 1963 in Tyler, Texas. And he came because he had to go to New York to take care of his immigration, because that's where he came into the United States, and he was trying to get his green card to become a citizen. And so so on the way to New York, he came and spoke to a little group there of Navigator Bible classes in Tyler, Texas, and then went on. And but having spoken to them, they liked so much they wrote him or called him, I don't know which, in New York, and said, "When you come back through, you must stop for 1 week. We demand it. You can't give us this much and leave us this way." So we began, of course, the fall, and we had our preschool retreat. And in having our preschool retreat, what could we do but talk about the Word and about Christ as life? But there showed up the assistant director of the student program for the state of Texas, unannounced, not telling us to see what we were doing. And he came and he was there with a frown over everything. And later he wrote me a letter to tell me how pitiful that whole thing was. So I began to realize I cannot stay here much longer. I didn't know where I was going to go, what I was going to do. So we come to November of 1963. A friend of mine who had also been reading Watchman Nee's books, who was a Southern Baptist evangelist, he heard that a co-worker of Watchman Nee by the name of Witness Lee was going to be speaking in Tyler, Texas. And this was Brother Lee now coming back from New York, back to Los Angeles, and stopping in Tyler. This was in November. He stopped the first time in September. Then he came back through in November. So he heard that he was going to be there, and he went. And he went and he heard him. And so he heard him Friday, and he heard him Saturday. No, wait a minute. He heard him Friday. That was it. And Friday night, somewhere around 10:30 or 11, I got a phone call. And it was him. He was sitting there in the same room with the host that had invited Brother Lee there, with Brother Lee and him. And Brother Lee said later, he never believed anything would happen out of this. Anyway, he told me, he said, "You have to come." Of course, he's still today a Southern Baptist evangelist. But he told me then, "You have to come. A co-worker of Watchman Nee is here. You have to come. Whatever it costs, sell your wife, sell everything. You have to come." Well, Abraham did, you know. Well, he didn't have to say a word. Listen, by this time, I was so fed up with the Southern Baptist system, the Lord did a good job. I was no longer a true blue Southern Baptist. I was fed up with the whole thing. So, and I'd been, like you say, I had read The Normal Christian Life now for 5 times, eventually having underlined the whole book. And then a co-worker of Watchman Nee in this country, I would have swam there. I would have done anything to get there. Whatever it would have taken to got there. So he didn't have to say anything. Once he said a co-worker of Watchman Nee. And this was Friday night. The next meeting was Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, and it was 500 miles away. I was there.